Welcome to episode 66 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. I had been working on a solo episode for a while now on the topic of knee-jerk and wishy-washy decision-making. It was actually inspired by a funny story of my mother recently, and it's taken a while because I wanted to put some research into it. The research side of things has been fun. It led me to yet another Chip and Dan Heath book called Decisive. I've also come across some other books with fantastic research into the art of decision making. But in my research, I came across a blog post written in 2018 called Beyond the Knee-Jerk Reaction. And while it served a great purpose for what I was looking for, it also took me down a different train of thought: teaching better decision making for students. Take a quick moment to reflect on average how many decisions we make for students each day. I tried this exercise and quickly realized it is quite often. Now, try something else. Think to a time when you offered decision making to students. How many times does a student make the split-second decision without even thinking it through? Or, one of my favorites, how often does the first student choose and then the others fall right in line with the same decision? The blog's author and today's guest is Kristen Vogel, an educator located in Vancouver, British Columbia. Her and a team created the Guts vs. Heads, a collaborative decision-making tool for the classroom to help teach students the art of decision-making. Again, something that is so simple, yet often overlooked in our schools. Kristen is going to help us understand how easy it is to get well-thought-out decisions from our students using a simple decision-making framework. Kristen, welcome to Anchored in Education.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm very excited to have you, and I'm excited to talk about our topic today, and we'll get to that in a minute. But before we get started, we would like to find out a little bit more about you and how you became anchored in education.
Well, I kind of had a different route into education. My father was a teacher, grade 6 teacher, and then a high school administrator. So, of course, I did not want to do that. So I entered university thinking I would study psychology. However, I quickly changed my mind, realizing that my background of education, growing up in a family of educators, was a big part of me.
Yeah.
So I continued on and changed my degree to education. And I think my first teaching job was in an inner city school in San Diego. So we had the Crips and the Bloods, and we couldn't we couldn't have certain colors couldn't be worn. So so that kind of I guess as a 21-year-old was a little bit intimidating. So I moved back up to Washington State.
Okay.
And I decided I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a teacher.
Oh.
So
okay.
I did a couple of odd jobs, and then I started TOCing. In America, I guess that would be substitute teaching.
Oh, sure.
I grew up in America, but I've lived in Canada now for, 25 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I was kind of doing the substitute teaching and starting to get my foot in the high schools in Seattle, Washington. And then I had an opportunity to go teach in Japan.
Wow.
So I went ahead and I applied for the job and I got it, and I ended up living in Japan for 3 years. And then my husband and we traveled around Asia for a bit, and then we settled down in Vancouver.
Okay.
And I didn't know if my teaching credential would transfer right up to Canada. So I did a couple other things. Actually, we bought a restaurant.
Oh, no kidding.
So Yeah, so we ran a restaurant for a while, which there is a lot of education in that as far as training employees, how you want them
Sure.
to be. And then the day I found out I was pregnant, I had a realtor come in and said, I have someone who wants to buy your restaurant.
Well, that was good timing.
I know. So we sold it. And then I was at home and I started tutoring kids because I needed a little bit more than just being at home with my son.
Sure.
And I started tutoring kids with learning challenges. And then that opened up my world to a whole different, because I was secondary English, and then teaching kids how to read is just, oh, it's amazing. As you know, as a
It,
first grade
it,
teacher,
it
like,
really is.
oh, yeah, and an honor to be able to teach a child how to read. So I did that for a little bit, and then I got into the public school system here up in Vancouver, Canada.
Okay.
And yeah, and now I have been an administrator for just the last couple of years.
Okay. And so,
So
you started off saying that your father was a teacher and administrator and you weren't going to do that. And you ended up, now you've taught and you're an administrator. So
yeah,
it's interesting how when that path is laid, before us, we can try to veer from it. But, if you're born to be in education, if this is your calling, it's going to pull you back. And that's what it sounds like it's done to you.
oh, totally. And then I got very in British Columbia, we have a redesigned curriculum which rolled out, and I got very, very interested in 21st century learning.
Yeah.
And the skills that our kids needed to enter into the world that we have now with so much technology and stuff. And so that kind of, I guess, re-inspired me, and I just dove super deep into what kids need to be successful. So the research in that area was quite fascinating, and that's where the decision-making skills comes in as well, right?
Yeah, and that's a great segue into the conversation for today. So on Anchored in Education and over our year of broadcasting, we've talked about decision making before, but we focused more on adult decision making, as a teacher or as an administrator. But today, we're exploring how to teach students to make good decisions. So, in your early explorations of student decision making, you found that they really only knew decision making by voting or just following their peers, what their peers were doing. Can you talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah, so I started, our district kind of had we teamed up with some decision making scientists, and they offered a sandbox session, which is kind of some workshops.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, like that is such an important skill to teach our kids, but I've never done it before. I don't know how to do it. All I'd seen in my classroom over the years was, okay, we need to decide on a movie. Well, let's vote.
Yeah.
Or we need to decide on how we're going to arrange our desks. Well, let's just vote. Is it this way or that way?
Yeah.
And it was always very, very teacher directed. It was me directing it and trying to gather input, but it wasn't really true input because I was still running the show.
Sure.
So what we saw was we had the voting, and then the other one, when I watched kids doing group work, it was always the dominant leader. So they would either be, if it was a group of 4, there'd be one person who had the ability to convince all the other kids to go the way that he wanted,
Mm-hmm.
or she. And so I was like, wow, it's kind of interesting as I began to be interested in this, and I began to observe what was happening in my classroom. I was like, wow, there isn't a tool here to teach our kids how to really make decisions.
Okay.
But there was a tool.
Oh, you're doing a little bit of foreshadowing as we're getting there. So, hey, I guess a silly question, would be to ask how important it is to teach decision making to students, because to me, we all know making decisions is something we all do daily, but we're going beyond deciding what to eat for lunch, or who to sit by, let's spend a few minutes discussing what it means to give students the opportunity to engage in nuanced civil discourse.
Yeah, so there's two types of decision making, as you just touched on. One is on kind of the gut level, or the simple decisions that we make, and that's like what to have for breakfast, or as adults, of should I turn right or left to figure out where I'm going, and then there's the level two, which is the ones that we need to like slow down and really think about what we're doing. And I found that that works really well in classroom decisions, but also really figuring out, it works really nicely with social studies as well, like figuring out why our politicians made some of the choices they've made,
Uh-huh.
or if there's something. I know in our area we have a traffic problem with one of our bridges, and so there was a lot of discussion in uh, during one of my classes about, well, should we make a tunnel? We have a tunnel right now, but should we make a bridge?
Okay.
And we really had to slow down our thinking and go, well, what is really important to us about this decision? And why? What are the factors that would impact our lives if we had a bridge? What are the factors that would impact our lives if we continued the way we are with the tunnel? And through that decision, we were able to come up with the kids were able to really use their critical thinking and creative thinking about things that we could do with that bridge, and how alternatives that we could have, that we could present to our politicians about that bridge as well. So it's, yeah, I don't, did that make sense?
It absolutely did. And did they have the opportunity to present that to the politicians?
We didn't,
Okay.
um, because we had a change in government, but the
Okay.
process was still very authentic. And it really made them think about, is the cost, because if the bridge would have been told, right?
Yeah.
So would the cost of going over the bridge, would that deter their parents from having them join like a different sports league because they didn't want to use the bridge? Or like just all of those factors. And what really happens is sometimes it's not as much about the outcome of the decision, but about the discussion that happens with the kids thinking,
And
that becomes this super fascinating point.
yeah, and I don't know about you, Kristen, but I think sometimes we as adults, and I'm sure that I have been guilty of this, and I try to be cognizant of it now, but we underestimate the ability of students to weigh in on decisions that we view maybe as adult decisions. And you gave a great example with the bridge versus the tunnel. But do you see that sometimes we leave out the student voice in a lot of things that really, I mean, they sometimes provide more valuable feedback than what the adults do.
Oh, yeah. Here's an example. I had just started really researching this decision making framework that we're going to get more deeply into. And I was just going around as my teaching day, and it was the beginning of the year in September, and we had to decide how we were going to do our seating arrangement. And so we're having a discussion, and I'm getting ready to vote. And I'm like, wait, I have this whole new tool of this value focused decision making framework I
Yeah.
could use. So I pop it up on the board and we go through, and they were, the teacher decides the seating arrangement, or it was, we have a random seating arrangement every day, or we had a couple different alternatives, and they came up with the alternatives. And the objectives of, the objective was they wanted to be able to learn. They
Hmm.
wanted to sit by a friend. And so we listed our objectives, and then we listed some choices that we would have them. They're called alternatives.
Okay.
And one little girl, she, at the end, so then we go through the whole framework of weighing our choices and stuff. And at the end, it's like, can you live with this? So we did do a vote of if you could live with this. And this one girl raised her hand and she's like, I can't live with our choice, which was to change our desk every month.
Mm.
And I was like, oh no.
Huh.
And she goes, I can't not like sit by a friend for a whole month.
Okay.
And so I gave it out to the class. I'm like, okay, you guys, what do you think we can do? And somebody came up with the alternative of why don't we do random seating and we change every week, every Monday we change. And so her likelihood, so this brings up like math and the probability, the likelihood of her sitting by a friend, you know, if we change it once a week is pretty high.
Yeah.
Um, and so then I said, is that something that you can live with? I said to the student, she goes, yeah, I can live with that.
Wow.
And so through
Yeah.
the whole process, it was like everybody had a seating arrangement that how we were going to do it for the whole entire year that they could live with. And if you don't give kids the power of voice, like you don't get teaching them the skill to be able to make a community decision that they can live with,
Yeah.
not that they love, not that it's their first choice, but that they can live with.
And that's the important part there. Okay, so you've mentioned the framework. I say it's time we get into this, and because
Okay.
just like anything that is rooted in quality research, you said there is a decision making framework, and I love it because all good frameworks comes with a nifty acronym, and this one's no different. So our acronym is PROACT. And for the benefit of our listeners, this stands for problem, objectives, alternatives, consequences, and trade offs. So I think it would be beneficial now to take some time to talk more about the PROACT framework in a little bit more detail.
Okay. Well, when I first was introduced to the framework, I thought, oh my gosh, this is revolutionary. This is going to change, the way I teach, the way kids make decisions. This is this is fantastic. And as I embarked on my master's work, I was like, wow, this has been around since 1970s. So, but it was used by Harvard professors in the economics department. So I was like, I was just kind of blown away because to me it was, what are we, 20, I guess that was 2018.
Yeah.
And and I thought this was like coming to me like brand new. So what it stands for is the first thing to do is you define the problem or the choice that needs to be made, and that's the P. The next thing is to figure out what is important to you or like what really matters. What are your objectives? Now comes the fun part is you get to use your creative thinking. What are the options or alternatives that you could use? And sometimes I just ask the kids before we even enter into a discussion as a class, I ask them just to jot it down on their thinking on a piece of paper, just so that they're not kind of swayed by their classmates. Because that still happens using the framework, as they can get swayed and the movement can start going. So sometimes if you take and you pause and you let them think and write it down on a piece of paper, maybe the likelihood of that might not be as strong.
Mm-hmm.
And we usually try to limit the alternatives to 3 or 4 choices that they could make.
Okay.
The next step is to explore the consequences. What could happen, or what are the consequences? This is where we have a discussion and talk about the uncertainties of if this happens, if we choose this way, then this could happen. Or if we choose this one, this could happen. Because each choice that we make, it always has positives and negatives. And so looking at those and understanding those positives and negatives and knowing that we could live with those is a big part of actually the decision-making framework. Then the last step is the trade-off.
Yeah.
So what's the best option after all things are considered? This is where we need to use both facts and the values of others. So this is where a lot of perspectives come into. We were making a class decision about where to go at the end of the school year. And it was really nice to hear kids thinking about other classmates or the fairness and the equality of the decision that we were making. And that was the trade-off.
Uh-huh.
And it might, the other critical piece, which I think I've stated earlier in our conversation, is It's not always going to be your favorite choice or your number one choice
Right.
at the end of the day. It's what can you live with it? And to me, that's like that kind of frees up a decision because we often get caught up into our want and our desire. And when you think like, oh, can I live with that? Yeah, I can live with it. Is it my first choice? Maybe not. I'd probably rather do something else.
Sure.
Or for the end of the school year, I'd probably rather go swimming than to a trampoline park.
Right.
But can I live with a trampoline park? Sure, I can live with that.
Yeah.
So so that's kind of it's a little bit of a shift, I think, in our thinking around decision making as well. And not this is what I want, this is the decision I'm making, but really being aware of all of the dynamics that it takes to make a good decision.
Absolutely. It shows us that it's more than, just coming to, let's say a fork in the road and deciding which way to go. I mean, there's alternatives, and there's is it going to get me to the where I need to go the quickest, and of course that's a very easy example, but there's a lot more to decisions than just making the knee-jerk reaction when something comes up. Now, what I find interesting is that we see these frameworks, and the PROACT framework, or the acronym for that, decision making framework. I love it, but sometimes we find these frameworks and then we find it's difficult to make them user friendly. But we have a classroom application utilizing the decision making framework called Guts versus Heads. I'm hoping you can explain this more for us today.
Yeah, so in a partnership with decision making scientists, we came up with a game or an activity called Guts versus Heads. And so you can come up with a real life problem in your classroom, or we've created scenario cards that you could use about problems that might come up in kids' lives. And so what we've done is we've put them on cards, and as a facilitator of this scenario, you have it's almost like a grid system. I'm trying to set it up using my hand in my office because it's very, very visual.
Yeah.
And very, very tactile. So you have cards. You have cards for objectives, and you have cards for your alternatives. And you write the problem or state the problem up above. So you end up with kind of a grid system where you have your objectives on the side and your alternatives on the top. And you can use these. So, but before you even start, you define the problem and you have the kids fill out a card, and that's their gut. Like if you had to decide right now, what would you decide about this problem?
Okay.
Because it makes them think about what would their initial reaction be, which is your gut reaction.
Yeah.
And now we're going to take the decision into our head. So we're going to think about it. We're going to think about all the objectives. And this is a beautiful part, especially when it's collaborative, is you get so many different perspectives in from kids. And it's where, their values really show through when you're using this. And then you can write the alternatives up on the cards. And then we have thumbs up cards. And then we call it the meh card, is when you have the thumb kind of going sideways.
Okay.
And then we have the thumbs down card. So we had a 2 thumbs up, a 1 thumb up, a meh card, a thumb down, and 2 thumbs down. That's what we decided to use on our cards, but you could also use numbers depending on how you wanted to facilitate it as the teacher. And so you get to move these cards, and it's very, very visual. And I remember the kids going like, oh, Miss Vogel, you can totally eliminate this row because it all has thumbs down. And I'm like, yeah, it does, because it's not meeting our objectives, is it? And they said, oh, that one only has, it has 1 thumb up, but the bottom one has all thumbs up. And so as you're going through the process, it's very visual, and the kids, they like looking at the cards moving around and being able to eliminate those. And then sometimes you end up with 2 that seem to be kind of even. And then you can have a discussion about that again.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so the cards make it really super easy. It is, as a facilitator, the first time you try it, it's a little bit daunting. But as you practice and you get more versed in it and you start understanding a little bit more about the framework, it becomes super user friendly and the kids can even start using it.
All right. And last I checked, this was still either in the prototype or development, or is this available for distribution yet?
Yes, it is actually. We have also written an easy. The district and the decision making scientists together have made the decision playbook, making thoughtful choices in a complex world, a teacher's edition, which goes through all of the things that take place in a decision making. It explores the two types of thinking and then stuff that we get that traps us, and then habits that help us. So there's a website, www.deltalearns.ca/decisions, and it has the cards that you can print out for the guts versus heads game. The book, I'm pretty sure the book is on it. If not, there's some really helpful handouts that are on it. So there's lots of resources there. There's a film actually on it of me teaching a class going through the decision-making process and the decision-making scientists also explaining why it's important. So it's quite a good website to explore.
Absolutely. And you gave the website, but I'm also going to put that website link on my website under today's episode in the resource section, so they can go there if they didn't catch that and click on it and go check it out. And I'm going to encourage everybody to do that to learn a little bit more about the decision making and also guts versus heads. So, Kristen, before we go, what are some final suggestions you have for promoting decision-making teaching in the classroom? And at what point do you believe we can begin introducing this to our students? Because I know before we started today's interview, I was talking a little bit about my days in first grade and saying that it would be great at the ages of 6 and 7 in first grade to have more on decision making. But is that a viable option to you?
Oh, completely. We've explored using decision making with kindergarteners all the way up and using literature of even having, there's lots of books where kids are making a decision about something and just stopping at that point and thinking about what other decisions could they make? What is the problem happening in this book? So we've explored using literature with decision making, and even when you're providing choices for the kids to do, talking about those choices and that those are decisions that they can make and they have input on. Yeah. So it's more, I think, in the classroom, like just making it more of a focal point of this is a decision, this is a choice, we do have options, and what's important to you. And it's just those dialogues that happen. We teach, as parents, like we start teaching our kids choices like really super early. Do you want to use the red toothbrush or the blue toothbrush? And probably if you asked them, they would have a pretty good reason of why they chose the red toothbrush. But it's taking the time to listen to them and to develop that skill of them developing reasons of why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope that, it's informed listeners today too, because like I said, whenever I was doing my research on a different decision-making episode, again, I was focused again on adults. And then I ran across this blog post written by yourself, and it introduced the PROACT, it introduced guts versus heads, and I thought, oh my goodness, I am missing the mark. And I think you have filled that void that we've had here on Anchored in Education, talking about decision-making at the student level. So, Kristen, I just want to thank you for taking the time to join us today to talk a little bit more about student decision-making.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope you realize that I do have a huge passion for this in our interview.
Yes, very, very clear and very informative. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I appreciate learning more about how we can help students make better decisions. You can follow Kristen on Twitter. Find her by searching @KVogelVogel. We also talked about the website that has more on the book and the guts versus heads that we talked about. I have listed that website on my website, escottengland.com, under the resource section for today's episode. Before I wrap up, don't forget to subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcasts. Also, if you could share it with your network on whatever social media platforms you use, that would also be appreciated. It wasn't all that long ago that Bella Trupiano, Anchored in Education's first student guest, came on and wowed us with some of her insight on how remote learning could have looked different. That's the power of student voice. Today's episode could really be filed under student choice and how to get the most out of student decision making. We spoke of Kristen's time in the classroom with student decision making as well as some of my experiences as a first grade teacher. Empowering students to make informed decisions and having input into things around the school does not take away from the autonomy of a teacher. I would argue that it is much like when we talked to David Marquet about intent-based leadership. He empowered the men on his submarine to make decisions much like he would as the captain. But when it came to, say, launching torpedoes, he reserved that right. Educators can reserve the right to keep some decision-making, but for the most part, the classroom and many areas of the school belong to the students just as much as the adults. So if we're going to change something up, let's get their input, and along the way, let's teach them how to make strong decisions that are well-informed and full of insight. Because remember, at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education.